Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DVS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 164th episode. I'm very pleased today to... Hi, Arvind. I'm about to give a little intro to you. Very, very happy to have back Arvind Subramanian to the podcast. Arvind is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He served as the chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2014 and 2018. I personally had the pleasure of knowing Arvind back in Washington, D.C. as a colleague in the IMF, where his last position was the assistant director of the research department. Arvind Subramanian, a warm welcome back to Kopi Time.
Thanks for having me, Timur. Great to be back.
It's great to have you. Arvind, these days you're busy talking about a book, but we will shelf it, so to speak, for the time being. I want to talk to you, if I may have your intelligence, on a recent article that you published on Project Syndicate, jointly with Shoumitro Chatterjee. It's titled, "The New China Shock is Hitting the Poor Countries the Hardest." So, Arvind, I'd like to go over it with you and ask some clarificatory questions, but perhaps if you could help us sort of define the first China shock and then talk a bit about the new China shock.
Yeah, as we all know, the first China shock owes to the work of David Autor and Gordon Hanson and others, who basically said that between, say, the late 90s and 2008, 2010, imports from China into the United States had a very adverse effect on employment, dislocation, and these were kind of concentrated in certain geographies, as it were, concentrated in geographies, which kind of magnified their political salience. And I think it's not too much to say that academic paper and findings really actually has transformed the debate on how the West, especially the US, has viewed the rise of China. Basically, assigning to China kind of some of the deindustrialization that happened, and a lot of the Trump rhetoric, including Trump's, more cogent intellectual spokesman. I think they basically channel Autor, Don, and Hansen. So that's the first China shock. Now, the second China shock, of course, is now that...
Just to stay with the first China, so one more second. You don't fully subscribe to the assigning of the entire driver of American deindustrialization to the China shock.
Well, just two things I would say is that, one, the whole question of whether the employment decline in manufacturing, how much was due to a secular, decline in manufacturing because of technology, as opposed to the China shock, I think is open for debate. I think the second thing, I think some of the more recent research is saying that, look, that is somewhat of a partial view of the China shock. Because there were also other aspects about the China shock that may have been quite favorable, not just the lower prices, but also what it may have done to other industries in the services sector and so on. But that's going to be contested. But the truth is that that paper had an enormous effect and still continues to have an enormous intellectual, influence on the way the world has viewed the rise of China, at least between, the 90s and early 2000s. Now, fast forward, I think that we're now in the second China shock, reflected in the fact that, as you know, Chinese exports have been rising again. China's current account surplus has been rising again. And of course, many people have, including Brad Setzer, has shown that if you measure the current account surplus in terms of the GDP of the rest of the world, it's even greater than it was, under the first China shock. If you remember, under the first China shock, China's current account surplus as a share of its own GDP peaked at about 10%. In 2007, I believe, or 6 or 7. So once again, with, China rising, making strides, especially in these new sectors, EVs, solar batteries, and so on. People in the West are talking about the second China shock. And of course, this is hitting Germany in particular very significantly. But I think what Shoumitro and I say in this paper is that just in terms of magnitudes, this second China shock is not that big for the West. The reason being, Temur, it's an important point to note, especially for those who try and understand trade, is that partly because of the China shock and partly because of technology, the West no longer competes in the sectors that China still continues to export, like labor-intensive manufacturing. Right. So they've diversified out of those things. And so if you take that out of the equation, then, China's imports or China's current account surplus is a much smaller share of activity in the West. It's now much more concentrated in particular sectors and particular technologies. So the new China shock from the point of view of the West is not the old China shock quantitatively. It's much more sectoral and technology and kind of competing for technological rivalry, as it were. However, the new China shock is quantitatively very significant for other developing countries. And that's kind of the main point of this article, to kind of quantify and show how big this is for other developing countries. And if you want, I can elaborate on the magnitudes, but yeah. So just as one should not take into account Chinese labor-intensive manufacturing to think about the China shock for the West, in some ways you should look only at labor-intensive manufacturing of China to see the impact on other developing countries. And then, of course, there are two or three statistics which are very striking. Let me tell you. One, of course, is that if you look at just imports of labor-intensive goods, low-skill intensive goods into, developing countries, low and middle-income countries, it's much larger than what it was at a comparable point for the China shock one for the West. It's like 4-5% of GDP. But much more, I think, significant is we have this new statistic, Shoumitro and I show, that although China's global export market share in labor-intensive goods has kind of come down a little bit from 55 to say 48 or 49, so there's been some vacating of export space, as we call it. However, for us, again, looking at it in slightly trade terms, you should be looking at that compared to China's share of the global labor force. Because roughly the intuition is that if you have low skilled labor, that should be represented in, how much you export. And on that measure, if anything, the gap has widened even since the peak, that the wedge between China's global export market share in labor intensive goods and China's market share of labor, global labor, that has in fact widened. And it's now something like 17, 20 percentage points, which is huge. So which is to say that China is not vacating export market share, which is in fact affecting all these other developing countries.
That's absolutely fascinating. Arvind, what I'll do is I'll put a link to the Project Syndicate article, because the statistic that you just described is actually visualized in that article, that the chart that you have. It is very, very compelling. And I believe right in conjunction with the chart, you point out that apparel sector is a good case study, that China's labor costs have gone up substantially, 4 times more than it is in India, 5 times more than Bangladesh, and still China maintains a fairly large share in the apparel industry. Arvind, I just want to contest that a little bit, if I may, and I want to hear your view. So it seems to me that China's share of global clothing exports is declining. Still substantial, absolutely 40% or so, but it's usually 50% plus. So over the last decade and a half, it has come down a bit. And to your point that it is costly, it is showing up in the profitability statistics. I just read about this from a big garments house, that China hosts 19% of global apparel companies, but their profit share in the garment sector is barely 10%. So how would you sort of square these issues? That A, the Chinese are not that dominant, and they're definitely not that profitable. So maybe it's a matter of time before they cede some of that to the Bangladeshis and Indias of the world.
So, Temur, that's a good point. See, one thing which we didn't go into, which maybe you have the evidence for, which is consistent with what you're saying, is that essentially, if you look at this, remember we've looked at it all in kind of value terms, export terms, right? apparently, terms of trade, Chinese export prices have declined in order to, kind of maintain a global market share. And that's what's getting reflected probably in your profit margins as well. But if that is true, then in kind of some quantity terms, China's actually share is even greater than the value share indicates. And China is holding on. See, because and of course, the other fact is that, as we said, wages are not only much higher than in comparable countries, they've also risen very rapidly in Chinese manufacturing. It's now today, the numbers we have, Chinese wages in Chinese labor intensive manufacturing, $10,000 a year, which is, in market exchange rate terms, which is, you would think that at those rates, you're going to be not very competitive compared to other countries, compared to Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, so on. So the fact that they are maintaining share, the fact that probably in quantity terms the share is even greater than the value terms indicate, and that part of it is being achieved by reducing export prices, which is then showing up in your reduced profit margins as well. Now, how long China can do it, of course, is up for grabs. But of course, this brings us to the question of how is China sustaining it even in the first place? Maybe the price is one of it. And I think there are, what Shoumitro and I think is there are two reasons that one can probably assign to this. One is robots, the use of robots. I think that, they're maintaining their competitiveness in the face of rising wages by just substituting robots and maintaining efficiency. And then the other question is, which, we have only more, maybe the IMF data now maybe sheds more light on this, is how much is happening due to kind of distortions of various sorts. Whether it's the exchange rate, whether it's subsidy, whether it's excess capacity and dumping, all of these things, that's, I think, a big part. And, we don't have a good sense of what the balance is between those two, but which I think is important to understand both in a normative sense and in the kind of the geopolitics of, the rise of China and where it's kind of positioning itself in the wake of the Trump shock.
Arvind, what I really like about our article, that it's very pithy. I mean, it's not, Project Syndicate doesn't let you spend thousands of words, but you covered some really important grounds. First, that we just touched upon, but there's several sentences there that really resonated with me. So you sort of harken back to the previous experience of hegemonic powers and how they sort of treated the rest of the world, accommodating some of their rights. So I would quote a sentence, paraphrasing a little bit: US's willingness to absorb imports and allow others to grow was an essential part of its global leadership. Would you like to elaborate that a little bit?
Yeah, I think today in the world of Donald Trump and all that has been done to the internet global economic system, I think one shouldn't forget what the United States did offer by way of hegemonic leadership, post World War II. We can spend hours, especially on what the US did on the political side and, on in terms of toppling governments, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, Charlie Kindleberger said that a hegemon should provide three global public goods, right? One is emergency financing. And that's why I think over the years, the IMF and the Fed have fulfilled that role, to a large extent. Then long-run resources for development, and thirdly, providing open markets. And, if you look at one of the charts in the presentation, I mean, the fact that the US, especially after the 70s and 80s, has consistently maintained these large current account deficits has meant that they've kept their markets open. One of the chief beneficiaries being China, and and Europe first, and then China and all these other countries. So in that sense, the US, by remaining open, did facilitate the rise of those poorer than it was, and so the question is China doing the same? If it has pretensions to global leadership, you can't be a mercantilist, and especially vis-a-vis those poorer than you, and then hope to have global leadership in terms of providing this openness to trade, as it were.
Absolutely. And one more quote from that, I think, sort of reinforces what you just said, which is the new China shock is not just about economic consequences. it is also a test of whether China can serve as a fair steward of global prosperity. Shall we crystal ball gaze a little bit and ponder whether
Sure.
China is in a position to do that?
I my own view is that this whole mercantilism and the emphasis on production, the emphasis on China first, having economic leadership and so on. I think that's the Chinese DNA, right? Now, one could argue that that is still consistent with China being, facilitating the rise of countries poorer than itself. Because after all, you could say, yes, it's mercantilist, yes, it's production oriented, but then there's no reason why it should not view that in a dynamic sense and say, look, we were like that on labor intensive goods until recently. Now, wages have risen, technology, we're becoming major producers of technology. So we should ourselves, while not losing that production mercantilist bias and obsession, we can have that in the new sectors, the high tech sectors, and so on, and vacate space, in the low skill sectors. So in principle, it's not incompatible, but in practice, whether it'll end up doing that, because the transitional costs are going to be huge, right? I mean, you have, rising youth unemployment. You have the fear that AI will lead to loss of jobs, and so whether it'll be willing to really abandon, these, or rather cede space in these labor-intensive sectors for poorer countries, I think is kind of open to question. Theoretically, not inconsistent, but practically, I still have my doubts.
Arvind, at the beginning of this conversation, you wanted to sort of separate the low value added, labor intensive part of the debate with the high value added part. If I may take the privilege of trying to combine them a bit, I look at Australian Policy Strategy Institute's Critical Tech Tracker. I look at World Intellectual Property Organization's patent database, and I'm sort of astonished by China's climb up the value chain and the critical innovations that are taking place in a wide range of technologies. Now, that may be a source of competitive pressure for industrialized economies, but it probably offers some degree of public good aspect for the entire world economy. I'm thinking green transition, buying, say, cheap solar cells from China, or for that matter, the better AI that is cheaper and more open source that is coming out of China than some of the Western counterparts. So wouldn't you say that that is the tool that China potentially has to play a provider of public good in those areas where it is innovating rapidly?
So that's Temo, that's a great point. Okay, and it's something that I've written about elsewhere. That it is true. I mean, obviously, if you look at solar panels, for example, I mean, the amount that itself is the biggest public goods that China has provided the world. And you look at Pakistan, for example, now, how it's transformed. The Pakistan energy situation is just extraordinary. It's happening in parts of Africa as well. Just cheap solar panels. If you have no power, you get cheap solar panels. At least you get power, when the sun is shining. It's a huge transformation.
Absolutely.
Now, and the same is true maybe for AI, because remember the whole debate about AI, it's not important for developing countries to produce this as long as, it's cheaply available and they have the capability to use and adapt it. So it is true that China can be a provider of public goods. And I think maybe that's what it wants to do. But, but will it at the same time, focus on this technology in the high value added sector and seed space in the other sectors? That's the only issue where, for me, that matters, and that's what I think it should be looking at. If it wants, it can even be a mercantilist and, be a production behemoth in all these high tech sectors, as it's already proving to be, do the innovation and etc. But, while at the same time, it should say, well, look, we don't need to produce garments and clothing and footwear anymore. We're far too uncompetitive in any case. And I think that I want to focus on, because see, the reason, Temur, is that, look, we know from the history of development that low skill manufacturing was the escalator out of underdevelopment for the successful cases. Now, we also know that it cannot be the same escalator for other developing countries because, the employment bang for for the low skill manufacturing buck is going to be much smaller going forward. No contest there at all. However, I still think, and this is where I kind of a little bit disagree with Danny, is that, for the poorer countries, it can still be a kind of important escalator, if not as critical as the past. So let me give you just one example to highlight that one number. Take India, for example, right? India's share of global apparel exports, probably 3 or 4%. China's, as you say, now is 40%. At its peak, it was 50%. India, so think of it, not even India, think of this way. That 40% at some stage, China cedes and that 40% goes to poorer countries. Let's, just doing the thought experiment. Let's say that produces half the employment that it produced even for China, or even a third. It's still a very big number for, poorer countries. And that's why I think that this is, for me, such an important policy issue for low and middle income countries.
Would that translate into policy advice for China in the sense of more consumption incentives, which sort of creates a economy that is more internally sustainable as opposed to dependent on exports?
Certainly, that's a big part of that, right? But this is something that people have been drumming on for 50, 20 years with very little impact. But I would say that maybe I would twist it or slightly nuance it the following manner. China has consumption share of China has to become more a consuming rather than a producing economy, right? Fine. But what I would urge upon the Chinese is that, this is a moment for global leadership for China in the wake of, the Trump shock and things. It has some, space has been opened up for global leadership by the actions of the Trump administration. And they seem to be serious about wanting to, provide a rival model or a rival, hegemonic leadership. Then, even if they are not as ambitious about, increasing consumption and becoming less mercantilist as a whole, at least in the short run, focus on, getting out of it or being much less mercantilist on these labor-intensive sectors that affect poorer countries. So that would be the kind of small nuance in the policy. If they became a more consumption-oriented economy, there would naturally be collateral benefits to, exports of these goods would come down, imports of these goods would go up. It would benefit other developing countries. But I think maybe, for example, if there are policy distortions that favor labor-intensive production in China, to act on those quicker and earlier, then it may be able to act on, increasing consumption more broadly.
Arvind, I was smiling a bit because I was having a distinct sense of deja vu. I may have asked you a very similar question 4 years ago when you were in this podcast, and you probably have given a very similar answer. Let me ask you this, however. If, to your point, that China has a bit of a mercantilist DNA, but it is beginning to see a very large part of its market slowly closing, meaning the US. And therefore, it has to rely more on accessing Africa and Middle East and South Asia, India included. Doesn't that lead to China being compelled to be a nicer, gentler counterpart?
Well, I thought, I've spoken to a few of the ASEAN policymakers and the thing. They are actually extra worried because the Trump shock is making China divert its goods towards other emerging market countries. So the competitive,
yes.
Yeah, some people attribute, the whole Indonesian riots partly to failed structural transformation and the loss of jobs in manufacturing. But if anything, anxieties have heightened in East Asia, Southeast Asia, about, the whole they see the new China shock as, dumping, diversion away from the US, into this, which actually makes them more mercantilist towards Southeast Asia rather than less. But to be fair, I think to the Chinese, I think they see that they need to have better trade relations with these countries. But again, in the short run, that is not manifesting itself as less competitive pressure, less mercantilism. If anything, in the short run, it's manifesting itself as more mercantilism, which has made policymakers much more anxious. I mean, if you look at, for example, the anti-dumping actions taken by developing countries, most of them are against China. So that anxiety is, if anything, more, not less, in the wake of the Trump-China shock.
Arvind, I also pick up that anxiety when I talk to clients and counterparts in the region. But I have to say that when I look at the trade data for 2025 so far, it seems to me that whether it is India or Vietnam, or even for that matter, Taiwan, which is, at a very sensitive position wedged between China and the US, they're all seeing their exports doing very well. India had a export winter vis-a-vis China in 2023-24. This year is going by over 20%. I see the same from Singapore. I see the same for Taiwan. So I sort of wanted to stay on with that gentler, kinder China, not only in terms of its terms of trade vis-a-vis its exports into developing countries, but also developing countries' market access into China. Have you seen any evidence of what I'm trying to suggest, which is that exports are beginning to nudge up?
So some data that Shoumitro and I did was to look at imports into China of labor-intensive goods. And you don't see that rise. So if anything, the import side in China is looking, and this is something that Brad Setzer has remarked as well, is looking less open than even a few years ago. So remember, there is a gentler China, or at least presentationally a gentler China, that has said, we will abandon our special and differential country status in the WTO.
That's right.
The China has also said, we will provide duty-free access to many African countries into this. But at least so far, at least what Shoumitro and I have analyzed, imports into China of labor-intensive goods from developing countries is not showing any surge at all.
What should India's strategy be in this context? And I asked that question with the license because I am talking to the former economic advisor of India.
For one thing, I think we need to, India needs to sort out the trade deal with the United States. I think that's absolutely imperative. I was in India recently and talking to these apparel exporters. So I was pretty struck by what they said. So, on apparel, US tariffs are 50%. And they said they are bearing the cost of 25% of that. So, in terms of who's bearing the cost of the tariffs, 50% is being borne by the exporter in this instance. And then, and therefore, the kind of hit to bottom line, to employment that can happen, maybe they can sustain it for some time, like China is, via smaller profit margins. But at some point, and remember, in the case of India, these exporters are not big. As we know, in India, the problem is, size. These are not Foxconn type exporters.
And these are low margin businesses.
Exactly, very low margin businesses, and therefore the impacts are being felt already. So that's a long-winded way of saying that a necessary condition for India to take advantage of the China plus one opportunity is to first sort out the tariffs vis-a-vis the US, and then of course this it should do regardless is refocus on some of the domestic reforms that many people have spoken about. And we've also written a little about, but that whole, because Temur, I advise some state governments in India, and I was beginning to be encouraged that, states like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh were in fact attracting China plus one investment. I mean, famously, Apple and Foxconn. Apple has said that it wants China to India to be its kind of long-term location for, many of these things. And the same thing was happening in other sectors as well. So in a sense, this Trump shock is not about current exports being affected. It's about a whole development model that was suddenly becoming possible once again, which has been kind of threatened and eroded by these. So, a trade deal is almost like a necessary condition for exploiting this opportunity.
Arvind, I traveled through Seoul and Tokyo recently during the time when our former IMF colleague Chen Young-ri at Bank of Korea was trying to explain how two-thirds of Korea's reserve would have to be earmarked for investments in the US and so on. It seemed to me that countries that have very strong trade relationship with the US have a corporate sector that really wants trade agreements with the US. But the public, whether it is in Korea or Japan, I want to ask you what the context of this is with respect to India. The public there don't seem to be that enamored by, a deal at whatever cost scenario. And my takeaway from my trip to Korea and Japan was that while corporate Korea, corporate Japan are very keen because very large part of their profits come from the US, the public sentiment is one where US soft power has been eroded substantially, and this government would struggle to go with their corporate line that just do whatever it takes to make Trump happy. Now, put that into the Indian context and a trade deal with the US.
Yeah, that's a great question, Temur. Of course, the whole Trump-India interaction has, really soured the Indian mood on the United States more broadly. There's no question about that, But there's a kind of, it depends on how you look at it also, right? You have to wonder how much of this was a necessary pricking of the Indian bubble of, we are so powerful, we are so much, we call the shots, etc., right? So some of that, souring reflects this kind of deflating of the bubble, but because it was a bubble, maybe some of it needed deflating, and therefore, maybe not such a bad thing. Look, let's be clear, dealing with this Trump administration and the kind of is fiendishly hard. Every country faced that, but it is what it is. You have to take that for a given. But then coming to your question, but it has surprised me how much, even though India doesn't, is not a large exporting nation, unlike Japan or Korea, despite that, the impact on small and medium enterprises in India has, I think, influenced policy sentiment and the perception of what needs to be done, which is the irony that it's
the gems and jewelry sector comes to mind.
Gems and jewelry, textiles, fisheries, and because remember, these are all these are not big corporate titans, but because of that, it probably resonates a lot with the public mood at large. That you want to somehow rescue these small and medium enterprises from this shock, and that's why, although there's been no big fiscal package as yet, which has been made available to these affected industries, but it has preyed on the consciousness of the public at large and policymakers as well.
Arvind, this is my understanding from some policymakers that I've heard. You have far greater access, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the contours of a trade deal from the Indian side was more or less set by mid of this year. Then couple of things. Put aside the India-Pakistan issue. I want to talk about the other one, which is the agriculture sector. The Indian line is that is a no-go, whereas the agriculture lobby in the US is still pushing Trump a lot to force India to open up a bit. Is that aligned with your understanding?
Yeah, I think, but I've also heard what you just said, that even many of these issues had been broadly sorted out. Even agriculture had been broadly sorted out. And that was not the impediment to the trade deal. by any means. So maybe a few things, a few minor issues need to be resolved. But by and large, that was not the obstruction, what was holding back the trade deal. Yeah. They had managed to come to some kind of compromise, or even on agriculture.
Okay, so that's good to know. So my understanding was that the India basically saying that's a red line, and the Americans did not necessarily want to agree that that's a red line. So your view is that the Americans are okay with that being a red line.
Well, see, obviously there must have been some give and take on that, right? I mean, but I don't think India could say we will not open up at all, nor could the US say open up your dairy sector entirely. So obviously they must have struck some compromise, which probably provides more access in particular goods for up to particular amounts, magnitudes, and so on. But whatever it is, it seems from what as you said, some understandings have been reached, which are apparently mutually satisfactory. But I don't know the details as like you as well.
I want to sort of combine the new China shock deliberation with the India context a little bit more. So I'm just kind of thinking that does it make sense for India to form a stronger alliance with ASEAN nations with respect to supply chain liberalization, and then the China plus one narrative becomes even more persuasive to foreign direct investors?
On the face of it, obviously the answer is obviously unambiguously yes. But remember that the elephant in the room here, of course, is that, and that's part of the reason why India didn't join RCEP, that India forging closer links with East Asia means de facto India will also have to open up to China in some way or the other. And I think it's that India-China relationship that needs to be sorted out for, even the, so integrating more with East Asia is kind of probably a no-brainer, but that's kind of the first step, as it were. The real integration has to happen vis-a-vis, China, or rather more openness. And there, as you know, it's kind of influenced and contaminated by the broader geopolitical relationship as well. And, in the last economic survey, the current chief economic advisor has been in the camp of saying that we should have closer economic links with China. And we should try and kind of separate the geopolitics from the economics. And I think that's probably the sensible way forward, that we have to come out and hopefully some of the, toying of the India-China relationship will have the consequence that, India can maybe separate out the geopolitical economics. And that, remember, I think even on the economic side, I think there are ways of using finer policy instruments to achieve your goals while minimizing whatever other perceived fears and anxieties. Obviously, if you're worried about technology, you don't have to let in a Huawei, but why not allow Chinese investments in, routine supply chain for, apparel or, footwear or all these, whatever electronics, whatever. So there is a way of, I think, maybe straddling the competing objectives, given the fraught India-China relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Arvind, I'm sure in your visits you've noticed there are MG cars all over India, Bangalore, Bombay, Delhi, anywhere you go. I don't think people think of MG cars as made in China cars, but they are a joint venture with full tech transfer, JSW and Shanghai Auto. I think, to me at least, Arvind, that's the roadmap going forward. Insist to the Chinese what the Chinese have insisted to the Western companies that, come to my country with joint venture and tech transfer, and then my market is open for you. Arvind, you were, of course, privy to some of the discussions during the RCEP days. My understanding is that there were avenues for India to have a very graduated entry into RCEP, and RCEP members were willing to do that. But it was, at the end of the day, just not going to happen. That even the China concern was addressed to some extent by the RCEP members. Is that your recollection?
See, I was not part of these negotiations, but remember that just to get the history right, I'm always, this happened towards the end of my stint in government, and, I didn't have much of a role in this, but India started turning protectionist once again around 2018. And more broadly, not just it was tariffs were raised. Um, you know, India started reviewing all these free trade agreements. So there was a broader ideological uh, turn away from openness, and that accentuated the RCEP China discussion. So it was not just out of the blue. There was a broader, and this was always, and I've written about this recently. And more recently, India has been imposing these absolutely protectionist quality control orders. So that DNA in India of never really embracing openness. You do it under duress, or for particular reasons that happened in the 1990s, because of crises or whatever. That the Indian DNA has never, and including this government, has never really been pro openness and markets and so on. It's now changing partly again because India is under pressure, and that's happening. But it's not a kind of atavistic sense, that visceral sense that this is good for us. We'll do it because we have to, not because we think. And I've been very critical of the quality control orders that were issued in the last 2-3 years, which were really horrendously awful protectionist instruments, discretionary instruments, and that was the DNA. So the RCEP should be seen in that broader context. There was a China element, but there was also a broader ideological U-turn, as it were, that happened.
So liberalization tends to be associated with the popping of a bubble. Okay, exchange rate bubble or an ego political bubble, etc. That's a very, very well put.
Or Tina, there is no in 91 we did it because there was no alternative, right? I mean, there was a crisis, and yeah.
Right. Arvind, in the article earlier, I had forgotten to ask you this issue, which is that in support of the mercantilist model, you can pursue competitive exchange rate by keeping an undervalued exchange and so on. You worked on the China team in the IMF back in the days, and I remember very clearly you had strident views on this issue then. Having looked at China over the last 20 years, do you think the Chinese are still maintaining an undervalued currency?
See, I don't follow China as closely as I used to, but I follow Brad Setzer very closely in what he's saying. And, because the whole thing has gotten more murky, as it were, right? The reserves no longer are held by the central bank; they're held by the commercial banks. So you don't know whether they're accumulating reserves and to the extent to which, and therefore, also who's doing the intervention on whose behalf is also. But I am kind of persuaded a little bit that, certainly in the last 3-4 years, you see how the current account surplus has widened, and Brad says if you look at the Chinese real effective exchange rate, it has, it has been over competitive, as it were, over this period. So although the exact, it's much more difficult to be precise, because unlike earlier where the intervention was obvious, the reserve buildup was obvious, now it's less transparent. But I do think, the exchange rate, subsidies, a whole bunch of these policies, you cannot have rising surpluses and a resurgence of mercantilism without some policy assistance, right? It can't just be that you're super competitive, and using robots and things. There must be some policy help, as it were.
Given the ongoing changes in Washington, D.C., including new leadership and the first deputy managing director of the IMF and so on, I sometimes wonder whether 2026 will be a year when, in addition to the tariff, the U.S. also starts using exchange rate issues as a weapon, if you will. Do you think a country like India could also then fall under the radar of U.S. Department of Commerce because the RBI does intervene on the exchange rate and has accumulated substantial reserves?
Well, for one thing, India's current account is still in deficit, right? I think that's one, and the remember the funny thing about India was that there was you're right that broadly, firstly, the current account deficit will go in India's favor. I don't think that will, people should look, I mean, they're worried much more about surpluses, right? Um, the second is that, you know, India did deviate from its long-standing exchange rate policy for about a couple of years, uh, uh, until early this year. In fact, as you know, I wrote about this with some colleagues. India, I think, blew up about um, 100,
Yeah.
50, $200 billion. So the old policy of, um, prevent appreciation when the inflows, and allow the exchange rate flexibility downwards, that had changed for some period, which would of course go to the redound to the credit of Indian policymakers vis-a-vis treasury scrutiny. But now and of course a lot depends upon how the dollar itself behaves, right? The dollar has been softer, so I think that India doesn't have to intervene as much. It's only when the inflows are strong into India that you get this kind of behavior, which potentially Treasury could kind of single out and say is problematic. But I think for the moment, I think that's not, especially with all these current account deficits, I don't think it's going to be a major issue for some time.
So, Arvind, the reason I brought this issue up in the context of the new China shock was that it seems to me that today's wisdom is that if a big country puts tariff on you, your best response is not to retaliate, because then you just make a bad situation worse. I suppose I was thinking along that line with respect to exchange rate policy. If you believe that your mercantilist counterpart is pursuing an undervalued exchange rate, do you then want to also play with your exchange rate? I think I'm hearing from you that don't.
No, see, no, no. Let me be honest here. I was always in favor of that policy of, see, remember, okay, let's step back. I was always in favor of not being too strong on opening the capital account to portfolio inflows, right? That was my original position. I still stand by that, because that's kind of a necessary or necessary condition for being able to control the to influence the real exchange rate. Once you open it up, it becomes much more difficult. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult to do. Having opened up, I think I was in favor of the policy of the asymmetric exchange rate policy, right? And I would continue to be in favor of that. So in that sense, to the extent that it imparts a mercantilist bias to the exchange rate, I would be in favor of that. I was always in favor of that, because if you believe in labor-intensive exports, but in the context of tariff shocks, I think it would be more legitimate, not just as a development tool, but just as a protecting yourself resilience tool in response to other countries' actions.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, very heterodox, but it totally makes sense to me. Arvind, great conversation, but I want to digress a little bit at the very end. You have written a substantial book, 750 pages, I believe, written jointly with, first of all, the title, A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey, co-author with Devesh Kapur. I know that for the listeners of Kopi Time in the US, the book is still not available. I think the same stands for the listeners of Kopi Time in Singapore, but those of us who are listening to this from India should be able to buy it, correct?
Absolutely. And hopefully within a month or two, also at least order it internationally as well. Yeah.
Do you want to give us a little hint of the scope and the framework of the book?
Yeah, this is a book that, let me just say that this is a book that Devesh and I have written, have spent 5 years writing, researching, and analyzing, and 10 years thinking. It's really a kind of comprehensive look at development. We have a new analytical framework for thinking about development, which is that development is not just, a narrow economics view of, markets and states, or a slightly broader view of states and society. What we, kind of say in this book is that, especially for a new country like, fledgling countries like India, many other countries around the world, what development comprises is, obviously, you have to build markets and an economy. You have to build a state. And in the case of colonial countries, you have to reconfigure the state. you have to build a nation. I mean, something that economists are very coy about addressing. How do you build a nation? And of course, in the case of India, with all its horrendous patriarchies and the caste system, how do you transform society? So nation, state, society, markets, four transformations. And uniquely in the case of India, via democratic politics from day one, universal franchise, and how India did that is kind of the focus of the book, so it's kind of an analytical and comprehensive development history of India over 75 years, and it's one of the things I'd like to impress upon your viewers and listeners is that we provide data on this for 75 years for almost everything. So it's a lot of new data, and we are hoping that not only will people read it and take issue with us on our main arguments, but that it will serve as a reference book, and hopefully it will spawn a 1,000 PhDs, contesting what we say in the book.
Fantastic. I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book. I look forward to it, but I did watch the book launch that you had in Washington, D.C. recently. And there's one chart you showed, and already I'm captivated by it, where in the horizontal axis, you have log of GDP of various countries, on the vertical axis, the democracy ranking, and how India, at an unprecedented low income level, had very high democracy scores and had to sort of live with it. Whereas in the case of China, we see the exact opposite, no improvement in democracy.
And how democracy both gave and but also impeded in some ways. So that's part of what the book.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether it'll. I hope it'll at least provoke, because as Simon Johnson very generously said, I think this is a book that is about India, but then is about development more broadly itself, and I think that's what we'd like to urge. Ask readers to check out whether that's a legitimate claim or not.
It will be checked out. Arvind Subramanian, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thanks for having me, Temur. Yeah.
Thanks to our listeners as well. This podcast was produced by Ken Delbridge at Splice Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. Kopi Time is for information only and does not constitute any investment advice. All 164 episodes of this podcast series are available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. For our research content and webinars, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.